Yeah, Jitesh.
Not so much a question.
Okay.
I had this sort of thought, and it's kind of like a recollection. I wonder if it came from Wired magazine or Nature magazine. But there was this question of, if you atomize the human body to its sort of elemental components, went to a hardware store and you monetize that body, would it generate? And I think there was a range of between $10 to $150, depending on where you trade that body. There's also this question incrementally that if you retained organs, tissues and your bone marrow and lungs, etc., it might be 45 million. In a peculiar way, you turn the question around and you try to restructure the body by resetting all these components from the periodic table and make a body. And that cost is unquantifiable. And I think this question, sort of this word undo that came from this sort of steep cropping of the Shimla hills took me there. So I take this liberty to kind of slip in something that's completely unrelated, but sort of speaks to ideas of like the NPR and things like that we spoke of in yesterday's panel in some ways. Thanks.
No, sounds good.
I'll try and make sense of this.
I didn't understand fully, but we'll talk later.
Talking about it. Anyway, so I'll try and make sense what I can of this panel together later, but this is open for everybody. So please address the question to whoever you want to address it to. And the floor is open. Yeah.
I don't know, I understood what Ashok has said completely, but and it seemed that there are lots of things you wanted to say, and then because of time limit also, because it's a complex thing and a completely different proposition. Yeah. Mostly what we talked about, including me, and which is very intriguing for me. But I was just, and also if I understood rightly, it also talks about a certain sense of artistic freedom, talking about like the way you started, like that if nature is unjust, and then you have the right to change it. So from there to here, so I could see a certain kind of propagation of how the way artists can work or take certain liberty in relation or in tune to various elements to nature. So now I'm very curious about this point of sacrifice. How does it mean in this artistic context from the perspective of an artist? So I don't know, like if you talk about a little bit idea about sacrifice.
Yeah. So it's a bit an odd word. I'm not sure if it's the right word, but the issue was that artists feel somehow all powerful and able to do all these things, and so, but the means to actually do that involves setting some limit to the endless expansion of forms and powers, and the form in which you set that limit is what we are calling sacrifice. So a friend of ours, the manner in which, for example, a friend of ours from Berlin likes to tell this story that in the 80s there was a huge drug scene in Berlin, and one sentence sticks in his mind, which is of a friend of his saying, from today I give up all my other plethora of drugs, I sacrifice them for heroin, So this is my sort of focus. And so that mode of cutting out like all the endless possibilities and saying this is what we can do and maybe we can try. That's the sense in which it was used, and in our work we do have this little bit that we sacrifice other things to work in the virtual space. We sacrifice a lot of other sensibilities, and I used to be painting in watercolor and so on. वो सब कट गया है, like it's gone. Because that's what you. So it's probably too big a word, but that's the sense in which it was. The heroin example is probably quite good. Sorry.
I want to say something.
Yeah.
Nilanjan, Actually, one of the things, I kept it very simple because it was a big history I was trying to say in the presentation. But actually, I think I really understand what you're saying. Because in this little 2.5 kilometer park, out of which I took maybe a quarter to talk about, a quarter of that 2.5 kilometers, there is a range of competing imaginations. So a range of possibilities, let's say artistic possibilities. I'm going to use your presentation. And then over time, there's going to be, I think this relates to Daryl's question also, over time there's a question of what's going to be forsaken, not just what came first, but what's going to be forsaken to have that space. Who gets to forsake what in order to get what they want? You know, all these kinds of questions are constantly valent in that environment. And I think that putting nature on a pedestal is a real problem because those real hardcore questions don't get asked. And that's something that Shiba was talking about yesterday when she was talking about deification and the problems of not being able to achieve the real ground level attitudinal changes through deification. So we wrap trees with thread. We build temples in parks because they're illegal temples, because we want to say that now Bangalore is a BJP city. All these kinds of things are happening, but we don't actually have a conversation. And the environmentalists say that trees must be protected, and they go to Rabindranath Tagore and whoever else. But in there's no conversation about what needs to be given up so we can have this thing called a nice tree that survives and shelters and reduces the temperature by nearly 3 degrees under its shade, so that people can just function without heat stroke.
Personally, I thought like that Ashok was meaning, that's why I was intrigued actually. I understood your point, but I think that Ashok was meaning from a completely different position. Yeah. So I don't know, like what you think, like it was more like kind of leaving that idea of sacrifice is leaving into a certain kind of duality, a certain kind of conflict, artistic idea, that what you redefine the idea of sacrifice. I don't know, like what you think.
Yeah, I think Amar wants to say something.
A small little remark. Just this thought, I mean, that if we could actually, at the very level of basic education, have it deeply sort of embedded in one's consciousness that if any of us were to be put into a glass case, we would survive just that far. And if you put a tree in that same glass case, it would survive just that duration of time that it can consume the amount of air. But if we were to cohabit that same piece of glass, that same vitrine, that we could cohabit far longer. And I think if that's deeply embedded at the level of education, maybe our whole experience of what we are in relationship to a tree might be altered dramatically.
One of the threads, sorry, Amar, you want to say something?
No, I just may take it in another direction. So if you want to continue, then
No,
I just wanted to ask another question.
No, I was posing a question, but you can go before me.
It's just a question addressed to Kanchi and Himanshu and maybe the others, but since I know a little bit about what you're doing, and I'm assuming that you are looking at pretty broad trends, and you're looking at a lot of data, not just within the subcontinent, but across the world as well. It seems like it's pretty much like a doomsday scenario. When you look at, say, what you showed the map about the hydroelectric in the Himalayas, or any of the coal mining, or many of the areas. And many people are saying as well, climate change, crisis, etc. I'm asking, I mean, since we are not in the public that does not know, is it real? How when you look at it, how close do you think? I mean, linking the rivers, is it the end of the story? What is the meaning of this doomsday and disaster? And I'm asking this question only in the context, not to kind of question you, but in the context of, for instance, it's also, would you like, is it a genocide? Is it a Holocaust? Is it actually this is a massacre, because there are species, insects, people, many things are being annihilated at a very vast level. So, like it has also happened in the past many times. So, how do you look at this?
So can I tag a question to that? Because I think it can probably tag to what you're saying is about one of the threads which seem to me about urban space. And Rahul, if you see urban spaces as circulations of capital and not necessarily an urban-rural divide, and then what is the idea of rivers, of nature, and whether the way you define doomsday is really a definitional issue, or whether there are ways in which seeming it's a completely different set of value systems and a completely different set of way in which you look at what the natural is. And then you come to a totally emancipatory kind of situation where technology, the city is a very technology capital-oriented labor kind of place. And that's the one set of things. And second is also that the imagination of the city, you brought it to the colonial imagination which a lot of our landscapes are like that. But are we continuing on that imagination of the city, or do we need to reimagine it? And that's a political equity question as well, that whose city are we imagining? And in that sense, when we frame this idea of regulation and nature, then is it just a governance issue of regulating well, or is it a more fundamental issue of what we are trying to regulate? Or so it's just an issue of corruption of a system? Or is it a fundamental issue that what we are trying to change should not be changed?
I certainly don't think it's doomsday at all. I think it's the very fact that we are sitting here and talking about contestation and conflict. I see it very positively. I think there's just the fact that there is a certain kind of resource politics playing out. People on not just in rural spaces but urban spaces coming out, questioning, counter-questioning, the kind of questions that we've come up with. How do we imagine our cities? How do we imagine these spaces? How do we plan for these spaces? I think it definitely, although it almost seems like, oh, this is a looming crisis and everything's going to collapse tomorrow morning, I think just the very fact that there is that circulation of ideas and lots of expression, I definitely don't think, I'm far more hopeful and I think one of the points that was made yesterday in terms of this time is a really small time in the larger scheme of things. I guess any one of us who decides to focus on this is what one needs to do now is, I think it's a comfortable place to think that you will play a role and there is the larger thing that will emerge. In terms of, I think it also links to the point that was earlier made in terms of when there's an increase of population, how much can you think of aesthetics? I think it's tied in with the idea of imagination. It's tied in with the idea of how we perceive justice and how we perceive these spaces. It's not just about aesthetics at all. So for instance, what is happening in Delhi right now is this redevelopment of colonies where all they're talking about, technically, they're talking about doubling up housing for government employees. But the imagination is to do it by raising the entire colony down and then rebuilding. So it's actually, this is not about how beautiful those spaces are, but what kind of injustices that perpetuates when you actually raise it down and create gated communities out of public spaces. So those kinds of things. So I think it goes beyond governance. It goes.
Can you elaborate the injustices involved?
In this example, the range of injustice is about, one is of course the idea of trees, which is very dear to a lot of people. Over 14,000 trees planted by residents is going to be cut, which is very familiar. But more importantly, I think these are also public spaces. There are small parks, there are walkways. It's used by all class of society, and these are spaces that anybody can traverse through. The moment these are gated communities, including going to archaeological monuments, is going to get gated. You'll have to knock and then walk in. In many ways, it's like the picture I showed of the barricaded, the prohibited areas, and otherwise anybody could actually go and herd camels and go to the temple, etc. So that is what is happening. And other than that, I mean, issues of water, issues of design, the whole bunch of things that are happening there. So I think that it's deeply rooted ideas of in governance. How do you view these spaces? Are you custodian of these spaces, or are you landlords? I think it's a very different imagination of how you will perceive the space and how you would build over it. I think in those ways. So yeah, I'm both hopeful, and I think if we infuse justice in governance, I think it will change things a lot.
What's wrong with what we did to the rivers?
Yeah. See, actually, Amar's question is little. Actually, situation is possibly more darker than him. If we look at how we started this conference, Bill started by saying that we are, P entails Q, and that it's easier to imagine end of the world rather than the end of capitalism. If you look at that, then it's very dark situation we are in. But I don't see it that darkly actually. In the same America, in last 20 years, more than 1,000 dams have been decommissioned. More rivers are getting free. In Europe, there is a phrase that is used, room for the river. Even a country, most engineered river space like Netherlands, they are talking about room for the rivers and moving in that direction. Some places in Germany also it's happening, I understand. So even in India, the fight for the rivers has gone to the extent of demanding certain rivers must be left free flowing, and particularly in Northeast India, it's still undammed. Western Ghat, there are rivers undammed. Even in Kerala, which was flooded with so many dams, there are 4 rivers which are undammed. So they're free flowing sort of, and there are a lot of struggles going on. The good news is that hydropower project particularly is really in slow down mode, usually slow down mode in the context of solar and wind. So more hydropower projects are not going forward. Not one river linking project has gone to implementation stage as it was planned. The national river linking plan, not one. And Ken-Betwa link, which was the first one to go on plan, its environment clearance has been challenged. It doesn't have forest clearance. Its wildlife clearance is challenged in the court. The people on the ground in the Panna are challenging the project. So there are a lot of signs of hope. In the Bangalore, where we can see the rivers the lakes on fire or with those foams, there are lakes which are actually being rejuvenated through community effort and through constructed wetlands, which are also treating the sewage and creating fresh water. So there are hopeful signs at many places in urban areas. We have been talking about urban rivers. We had a conference in April in Pune about Maharashtra's urban rivers. And we saw that people in Nasik, people in Dhulia, number of places they are in Pune, they are fighting against riverfront development, and encroachment on the riverbed and so on. So there are, positive signs, and I have a feeling that, of course, we are still downhill. We will continue to in downhill journey, but at the same time, we can see that it has a finite path, and beyond that, I think there is going to be a turnaround. That's the whole thing.
What will drive that? What is driving that hope?
Well, all these examples, all of this,
So
yeah.
What is driving those examples?
Well, I think.
What are the forces driving that?
Well, I think number of factors are driving. Some are global economic factors, some are community efforts, some are efforts like what Kanchi and fighting for proper regulation, proper public consultation process, proper even basic thing is and which nobody can dispute. Let us take an informed decision. Ken-Betwa link, how many trees it is going to cut? You are talking about 14,000 trees in Delhi and people rising up. Ken-Betwa river link, how many trees it is going to cut? 23 lakh trees of girth larger than 20 centimeters. And the Forest Advisory Committee, which gave a clearance for, said that by the time the submergence happens, there will be equal number of more trees going above 20 centimeters girth. 46 lakh trees for one project. When the Ministry of Water Resource Secretary, we all know him, he was sitting in as a Secretary Ministry of Water Resources, which is the highest bureaucratic position in India. I asked him, what is driving this Ken-Betwa project? Who is going to benefit? Bundelkhand is not going to benefit. So who is going to benefit from this river linking project? So his answer is the answer. He said it's 30,000 crore project.
But you still believe P will not entail Q.
No, I am not believing. That was his proposition. Yeah. We have to fight against that.
Yeah, I see that. Sorry, you want to?
Yeah, sorry, just to add to that, because I've worked on a number of these infrastructure projects which have been mentioned, etc., including some of these hydroelectric projects. And you're correct saying that a number of these have been stalled, and hydroelectric is actually no longer a viable proposition. So I think, the environmental lobby is fairly alive and kicking in this country. And I think capital also recognizes, so there is a dialogue that is happening. There are necessary checks and balances, however much we may not like to believe that those checks and balances are not working, but they are working. So yeah, hydroelectrics, I think the story largely as things stand, and not only just because of the environmental concern, there are other concerns also. The government has also expressed it, regulators has also, expressed it. So I think, everybody is in some ways, it's not black and white, is morally invested in a larger story as well. That was one point. The second point was with regard to, there is also a swing of the pendulum in terms of extreme positions being taken. I think in the previous regime, there was an extreme position, everything is, brought to a standstill, and you have, and you may also perhaps be finding another extreme swinging saying that, okay, now, let's road roller over everything. And so somewhere the process of dialogue or public dialogue is broken. There are extreme positions being taken on the environmental side, there are some in reaction, extreme positions being taken on the capital side. And somewhere, syncretism of dialogue, of what is possible and regulation, etc., which historically used to come from the government. There was a time when Indira Gandhi turned around and said, saying that, okay, the tiger, we need those tiger reserves, and those tiger reserves are sacrosanct. So no-go areas, that kind of a dialogue, I think, is missing in the public space. That was just a comment I thought I'd add to the overall picture.
It's a very important intervention. In fact, one way in which that itself can be polarized is by, again, people raising and pointing out that, well, there's clear-cut commercial interests which are at the bottom. I'm saying that you can endlessly polarize, those rhetoric, that rhetoric. But what's also important, and I think going back to what Amar also asked earlier in terms of, how do you look at the detail, what happens on the ground, and all the examples you gave really are about people who have been able to respond on the ground to a notion of nature. And I think this is very important for us to understand that sometimes we're talking about nature in different ways. Right? I think there are different ways in which, from an artistic point of view, from the point of view of the conservationist, the point of view of the person providing a larger framework, then we are talking about how it is actually experienced in terms of livelihood. How do peasants come together and respond to issues is sometimes very different from the way in the same neighborhood, say the trading community will respond. A very good example to understanding a lot of what we are talking about is going into those states particularly where you see tribal and non-tribal communities having been sort of coexisting for the last 300 years, producing different kinds of very ingrown interests. So you have local ecologies which traditionally have been looked after by tribal communities. Now 150-year-old Banya communities also trading in goods which are and becoming middlemen. So in India, we cannot ignore the concreteness of caste and the way it operates. How space operates at every level through this. And one very fundamental element of the way in which caste differs from a non-caste based approach is the fact that the immediate relationship to materiality, which say in Adivasi cultures and tribal communities one actually finds, is often absent, because in a caste-based context, already you have divided space in social terms, right? So in Indian villages, space is not just one terrain. It is immediately 4 or 5 different terrains, and people will not move from one into the other. Now this thing gets extended into cities. I often talk about how when people said when we opened up an office in Dharavi 10 years ago, oh, now you're starting a gentrification process. I said I'm still waiting for it, because nobody gets into Dharavi because of the way in which there is a certain narrative of caste and a certain kind of also sometimes a disdain, or that this is a very problematic space in the way you even negotiate it as a space of occupation. So the thing is that we have to factor in caste, and I think what is happening on the ground, very often the success stories are those stories where people have been able to negotiate the concreteness of livelihood around which, and then they have to deal with abstractions. What is often what polarizes is abstractions. So you can bring in a very abstract narrative of justice, which can actually be very anti-environmental, because you're bringing in the human element, and you can also create an abstract notion of nature and environment in a manner which again does not help. So can we somehow become aware of how our own discourse often tends to be over-abstract, and that is really when you universalize to a point where we have moved where maybe an artist like Ashok has to defend he's negotiating the need to create, against a very hard notion of nature at one point of time, from one point of view. But on the other hand, I think, and very elegantly, I think I really like your framework and the way you brought in the notion of the sacrifice, and that was also picked up by the questioner. I feel that these are very important things to bring in, a concreteness, and that is why sometimes urban practice or rural practice or activism, the best thing about that is that it actually makes you deal with the concrete. Sometimes people who, like the confidence in which you can say I'm going to be optimistic is because you are immersed sometimes in a manner which is more than what I in the city are simply reading in newspapers. So that is a very important point too.
I want to ask you, because this film you're talking about, which I've seen as well, about the parrot speaking to the human species. Yeah. I, sitting here in India, I'm unable to conceive of myself making such a film, because I cannot speak to one human species. From where I grew up and where I'm located, I don't see the human species as one thing. And I see that a lot of that in Western art, that they're able to speak to this global idea of this human species. And I'm unable to do that. So I'm just thinking that, who's the parrot talking to when you're speaking?
Actually, the parrot's specifically talking to the builders of the Arecibo listening station specifically, and they are sort of a metaphor for a particular hegemonic instantiation of humans that don't represent, obviously, all humans are all ways of life, as we talked about, but a particularly virulent mode of civilization that has brought with it enormous amounts of destruction. The artists are from Latin America, and they're speaking specifically to a scientific intervention on the ground that is connected to the extinction of a specific species, who also, isn't speaking for all animals, but because it's an artwork and it's a philosophical think piece. The point is to raise larger questions about.
Is there a larger question outside the local? That's a question.
That's a good question.
How do I even talk of the process of that larger question? Because to me the larger question is also, obviously that's the larger question.
I think the larger question that Agarwal and Kóvskaya bring out has to do with modes of civilization, which there are certainly many varieties of modes of civilization that human beings have, but if there's something that's fairly bedrock, we all have ways of living that are systemic. Very, very few people are hermits living alone, it's almost impossible. We are collective animals. And so, which kinds of modes of civilization leave the kind of destructive ecological footprint, or actually wreck the ecosystems in which we are embedded and in which we require functioning to survive actually in the long term, I think is the kind of question that those artists in particular are raising. And so when I talk at this sort of higher level of abstraction, of course I believe that very specific local research about the historical and local specificities of how these programs and projects get played out, how they're embodied in actual everyday practices in real places, among real people, these questions have to be answered. But I think there's an important value to a dialectic between looking at the very specific local problems and realities, and also pulling back and asking bigger questions, just really putting them out there, which is who are we, and what are we, what kind of a thing should we be in order to even merit surviving the mess that is now in the world because of the actions of some forms of human civilization.
I'm going to sort of engage with you on that a little bit, but all the recent last 10 years of new young scholarship I've seen on the nature question have been very local, very specific to specific conditions. And the extraordinary young scholarship on the nature question which has now come out. But I don't see and I see a lot what's coming out from America and Europe is this dealing with the globe as a planetary system, and these grand generalizations of what the world is, and these circulatory terms which become like definitional terms of who we are in a sense. And I don't see any such literature coming out from here in what you call the Anthropocene framework, not only in science and social science as well. I wonder if there's something in the way we inhabit, or we're just unable to look at that question, or we just don't see the world like that. I don't know. I mean, I've often asked myself the question, because they're coming from the US. Like, Donna Haraway, or, Karen Barrett, and all these sort of grand sort of things. But we don't have that kind of scholarship here, or we don't address the question in that same way.
What about those guys? I mean, I can't answer I can't answer from this context.
What is the reason?
Maybe someone else here has a question about modes of thinking.
No, I wanted to suggest one thought problem that, it seems that capital is able to invent this, in collaboration with, state forces and so on. I mean, if you look at the trajectory of something like Reliance Bombay group, going from, kapda to dhaga manufacture, to saying that, oh no, this is cotton, no, let's make something better, going back to, rayon or whatever, polyester, huge polyester institution, then saying this is not enough, let's go back up the chain and actually make the petroleum to make the polyester. We are the biggest refinery in the world. Then saying this is not enough, let's go out into sea, and they have a name for it. It's called backwards integration, right? There's an infrastructural level at which capital is able to invent its own chains. And we seem to be lacking, or the larger we seem to be lacking the ability to think in this way. It's always very horizontal, it's about solidarities and, and about resistance, but not about this level shift. And I think that imagination is necessary. So that would be also the way I was thinking about कि करना क्या है और किस direction में करना है. और हमारे लिए there was an answer at a certain point about certain things which appeared at that scale, and we could do it because they were online projects or whatever. But I think that is the question, that how do we let everybody else sort of get away with it, whereas we have to be sort of horizontally integrated. Right?
Very good point.
Any more reflections from your room?
I think everybody's gone.
In these very interesting expressions of optimism and pessimism and so on that have surfaced. And Rahul, your point about concrete and abstract ways of formulating the problem. And yeah, I can't help feeling that there really are, I mean, there's certain things that should go without saying, which is that there's always scope for improvement at the local level through local struggles and so on. I mean, I'm glad you said it, but it should really go without saying. Who could deny something like that? And if you can improve the lives of 5 people for 2 minutes, it's worth doing. And so none of the large-scale issues that we face should come in the way of those what should be banalities, but in case they're not, it's worth saying them. But here's one of the issues is that our topic began with the framework of Anthropocene, and Anthropocene formulates things in nothing short of terms of the planet. And they talk of thresholds, which are thresholds of huge planetary factors, right? And tipping points which have to do with really large-scale movements of the physical, our fragment and our galaxy of the physical universe. So it's in the context of that questions arise as to what are the institutions and bodies which address this? And institutions and bodies that have done it have been, started off in Brazil, they went on to Kyoto, they've been in Paris and so on, and Copenhagen and then Paris and so on. And, Himanshu quite rightly raised the point about how people who are suffering from river pollution have nothing to do with the decisions that are being made, and the people who are making the decisions have absolutely no proximity to the problem that is at stake. So there are local questions of governance that arise, and the real problem scale, Rahul, that you were, I think, misleadingly describing as abstract, but rather that the forums in which decisions are made are forums that are highly centralized and international. And that's the issue, not concrete. Of course, concrete is, that's another part of what goes without saying and banal, that there are concrete struggles. So here's the difficulty is that as soon as any part of the world puts serious constraints, right? Not absolutely local, but serious constraints, and has local governance. By the way, Bolivia has managed to do quite a lot. But don't forget that Bolivia, first of all, has put serious capital controls, right? If any country really puts serious constraints on capital, there's going to be capital flight. This is an anxiety that the only countries that avoid it are countries like Cuba and North Korea for obvious reasons, right? So if you're in a global financial system, right, and you put anything like serious constraints, not the local things that you're rightly optimistic about, but you put serious constraints on capital which allow for the spread of local governance and policies that would come in the way of profits of corporations and so on, there's going to be an anxiety about capital flight. And people don't do it. Governments don't allow it to be done. Just think of what happened. In Brazil, Lula got elected on a tremendous working class movement. Fantastic movement. I mean, the odds that he faced are much greater than the odds we faced against this disgraceful government that is governing us now. Right? Much worse what Brazil was facing. And a proletarian movement got Lula elected. He couldn't do almost anything that he promised his people he'd do. On issues of climate, he couldn't do almost anything because of an anxiety about capital flight. It would have been irresponsible. If capital had flown out of the country, there would be massive unemployment. Right? So he just tinkered around with little things and so on. So those are the large-scale problems that one raises when one says one can't imagine the end of capitalism and so on.
Thank you, Akhil, for that linking actually the panel very well. So I think it's the right time to end on that note. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you for the comments, and thank you for the panel for keeping the times. Thank you.